Through fires and floods, these Babylonian tablets survived, recording lists of ancient kings whose reigns span tens of thousands of years, then break at a single catastrophic flood. To many, it looks like myth. But what if this strange before and after is a warning? If 5 lost world orders came before ours, what patterns did these scribes see repeating, and how close are we to becoming entry number 6? The evidence begins with a slab of clay. In the vaults of the Ashmolean Museum, a clay prism sits behind glass, 8 inches tall, covered on 4 sides with wedge-shaped cuneiform. Its official tag reads WBB 444, but most know it as the Weld-Blundell Prism. This object is not a relic of legend or a prop for speculation. It is a physical record, pressed into wet clay nearly 4,000 years ago and hardened by accident, not design. In 1922, a fire swept through the region where it was stored, baking the clay so thoroughly that the ancient writing became nearly as permanent as stone. The prism's survival owes as much to chaos as to careful preservation. The story of how this prism reached the museum is as tangled as the script itself. Herbert Weld, a British collector with a taste for the extraordinary, acquired the artifact in the early 20th century, likely through the hands of Edgar James Banks, a dealer and archaeologist whose fieldwork in Larsa was as much about negotiation as excavation. These were years marked by political upheaval and loose oversight, when the Ottoman Empire's collapse turned Mesopotamian antiquities into currency on the open market. Banknotes and bribes changed hands as often as shovels. Yet the prism survived, passed from dig site to collector, and eventually to Oxford, where it was catalogued and registered as WB 444. What sets this prism apart is not just its age or the drama of its journey, but the purpose it served. Babylonian clay tablets were not made for posterity. They were tools of administration, receipts, inventories, contracts, and in the case of the prism, official king lists. The scribes who shaped these records did so for clarity and order, not for myth-making. Clay was cheap and abundant. A scribe would roll a lump into a tablet, inscribe it while still damp, and leave it to dry in the sun. But when disaster struck, a fire from war, a collapsed roof, the heat could transform a fragile note into a ceramic time capsule. That is how so many of these records outlasted the empires that made them. The Weld-Blundell Prism holds 4 columns of tightly packed names and numbers. Each line records a king, a city, and a span of years, all written in the sharp, methodical hand of a trained scribe. The prism's format is deliberate, not decorative. It is a ledger, a bureaucratic tool intended to settle questions of succession and legitimacy. Its authority comes not from legend, but from the fact that it was meant to be checked and referenced, just as a modern accountant might consult a ledger or a registrar might check a list of office holders. The physical reality of the prism, its weight, its baked clay, its registration in a museum, grounds the mystery that surrounds its content. Before any debate over numbers or lost eras, the artifact itself stands as proof. The Babylonians recorded what mattered to them, and they did so in a form built to last. This is not a rumor or a copy of a copy. It is the original, preserved by accident and intention, and it is from this slab of clay that the story of cycles and lost worlds begins. The prism's surface, still sharp after 4,000 years, lays out a sequence that defies ordinary history. It begins with a world before the flood, a realm ruled not by ordinary kings, but by figures whose reigns stretch far beyond any human lifespan. The list opens with Eridu, described as the first city. Alulim is named as its king, ruling for 28,800 years. From there, the sequence moves to Bad Tibira, where Enmenlu-Ana is said to have ruled for 43,200 years. Larak follows, then Sippar, and finally Shuruppak, each with its own king, and each with reigns measured in tens of thousands of years. In total, 10 kings across these 5 cities are recorded as ruling for an astonishing 456,000 years. The numbers are not hidden in poetry or myth. They are listed plainly, as if part of an official registry. The scribe does not explain, embellish, or justify. The names and years march down the clay in a strict order, broken only by a single, abrupt divider, the flood. After this line, the list resumes with a new sequence of cities and kings, their reigns suddenly shrinking to lifespans that fit within the boundaries of memory and genealogy. The difference is stark. Before the flood, rulers are measured in epochs. After, they are measured in generations. This structure is more than a curiosity. The king list treats the flood as a hard reset, a line that separates one world from another. The 5 cities before the flood are not presented as legend, but as the foundation of everything that follows. Their kings are not described as gods or monsters, but as legitimate rulers whose names and years must be preserved. The implication is clear. There was a time before, and it was swept away. The sheer scale of the numbers is impossible to ignore. 43,000 years for a single king, repeated again and again, adds up to a span that dwarfs all of recorded civilization. The total, 456,000 years, pushes against the limits of belief. Yet the list does not blink. The scribe's hand moves from one name to the next, as if recording tax receipts or land boundaries. The message is not one of fantasy, but of record. There were 5 cities before the flood. Their kings ruled for ages. Then the waters came, and the slate was wiped clean. For anyone reading the Prism today, the effect is unsettling. The list does not offer comfort or explanation. It presents a pattern. Great ages, a sudden break, and then a new beginning. The 5 before ours are not described in detail. Their lives, their achievements, their failures, none of this survives. Only their names and their impossible years remain, like tombstones for worlds erased. The warning is not shouted, but it is there, pressed into clay. What came before can disappear, and all that may survive is a list of names and numbers. After the Weld-Blundell Prism arrived in Oxford, the Sumerian king list drew the attention of scholars searching for more than just names and dates. Thorkild Jacobson's 1939 edition became a milestone, not for confirming ancient history, but for exposing its manipulation. Jacobson noticed that the sequence of cities, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sapar, Shurupak, rarely matched the archaeological record. Instead, the order reflected political motives, each city's placement serving to legitimize whoever commissioned the tablet. The king list, he argued, was less a chronicle than a political manifesto, tracing lines of authority back to the most ancient sacred centers to justify the present. Samuel Noah Kramer, another leading Assyriologist, found that the king lists were copied and altered over centuries. Names appeared or vanished, reign lengths stretched or shortened. Kramer saw scribes as active participants, not passive recorders. In times of upheaval, a scribe might add a dynasty to strengthen a ruler's claim or erase a rival's legacy. When Kish's kings rose to power, the city's prominence in the lists grew. Later, as Babylon ascended, its royal line gained new significance. The king list became a living document shaped by the ambitions of each era. The lists are marked by deliberate exaggeration. Before the flood, reigns stretch into tens of thousands of years, dwarfing the more believable spans that follow. Jacobson and Kramer saw these numbers as products of a scribal culture obsessed with numerology. The Sumerians counted in 60s, and early reigns often align with multiples of 3,600 or 36,000. These figures were chosen for their symbolic power, not for accuracy. By linking kingship to cosmic cycles, the lists reinforced the divine right of rulers, weaving mathematics into mythology. Jacobson's critical edition revealed how the king list changed over time. Some tablets omit entire dynasties or cities, others insert legendary figures to bridge gaps. Each version reflects the politics of its day. The order of cities could shift. Eridu might lead the list to highlight its ancient prestige or fall behind newer power centers. Even omissions and additions were strategic, designed to rewrite the past in favor of the present. The king list's role as propaganda is clearest in the case of Sargon of Akkad. Later versions place him as a direct successor to earlier dynasties, smoothing over historical complexities. Archaeological evidence, however, tells a more tangled story. The scribes who maintained these records were not impartial. They shaped collective memory to serve those in power. The king list's authority rested on its ability to legitimize whoever ruled. Modern scholarship warns against taking these lists at face value. Their numbers and sequences are not simple facts, but artifacts of ambition. The king list is a crafted narrative, its exaggerations and omissions revealing as much about its makers as about ancient Mesopotamia itself. The numbers on the Weld-Blundell Prism are so vast they seem to break the rules of reality. Alulim's 28,800 years, Enmenlu Anna's 43,200. But these figures are not random. They are products of a system that shaped every calculation in ancient Mesopotamia, the sexagesimal, or base 60, counting system. In this world, 60 was the foundation, not 10. Scribes used units like shar for 3,600, nir for 600, and shargal for 216,000. These were not just numbers. They were building blocks for everything from grain tallies to cosmic calendars. Daniel Mansfield, a mathematician at the University of New South Wales, has spent years decoding Babylonian tablets like Plimpton 322 and Psi 427. His research shows that the Babylonians used base 60 math to solve real-world problems, surveying fields, dividing harvests, and even mapping the night sky. When scribes listed a king's reign as 28,800 years, they were writing 8 shar. In their terms, it was as neat and logical as saying 8 dozens for 96. The enormous numbers on the king lists follow patterns. Multiples of 60, 600, or 3,600. Alulim's 28,800 years is 8 times 3,600. Enmenlu Anna's 43,200 is 12 times 3,600. The total for the antediluvian kings, 456,000 years, is exactly 60 times 7,600. These are not wild guesses, but products of a system where every large number carried symbolic weight. This sexagesimal logic runs deeper than the king lists. In everyday life, Babylonians divided the hour into 60 minutes, the circle into 360 degrees. They calculated areas for dividing land and solved disputes with ratios that modern mathematicians only rediscovered much later. Mansfield's work on tablets like Psi 427 shows that these calculations were not theoretical. They were used to measure fields, set boundaries, and settle arguments. The same logic that produced impossible rains also built canals and ziggurats. The king lists are not alone in their use of symbolic numbers. Omen tablets, ritual calendars, and even mythic texts repeat these patterns. The reigns are not literal lifespans, but statements of order and cosmic balance. The numbers signal eras, not individuals. When the prism lists 10 kings ruling for 456,000 years, it encodes a cycle, not a genealogy. The math itself becomes a kind of language, one that speaks to the order of the universe as much as to the history of kings. For scholars like Mansfield, the shock is not the size of the numbers, but their precision. The scribes who wrote the king lists were not inventing fairy tales. They were encoding a worldview, using the tools of their trade. The reigns are not meant to be believed as fact, but to be understood as part of a system that made sense to those who lived by the rhythms of 60. The result is a document that blurs the line between record and symbol, between history and myth. The numbers are a code, and the key is the logic of base 60. At the southern edge of ancient Sumer, the ruins of Eridu rise from the flat, cracked plain. Archaeologist Fuad Safar first cut a trench here in the 1940s, uncovering a city built in layers, each one stacked atop the last like pages in a book. Beneath the sand, Safar and Seton Lloyd traced the outlines of at least 18 distinct phases of rebuilding, stretching from 5400 to 2200 BCE. The oldest temples rested on virgin soil, their mud brick walls eroded by time and flood. Above them, newer shrines rose, sometimes built after fire blackened the foundations or after water left a blanket of silt. The most striking discovery came in the form of a thick, sterile layer of alluvial clay, wedged between two periods of occupation. This flood deposit, dated to around 2900 BCE, ran across the site like a scar. It wasn't the only one. Similar silt layers appeared at Shuruppak and Kish, each marking a moment when rising rivers forced people to abandon their homes. Yet after each disaster, the city returned. Farmers dug new canals, priests rebuilt the temple of Enki, and life resumed as though the waters had never come. Harvey Weiss, decades later, studied these layers with a geologist's eye. He found no evidence of a single civilization-ending cataclysm. The flood deposits were real, but local, signs of a landscape shaped by unpredictable rivers, not by a world-destroying deluge. The sequence at Eridu told a story of survival, not extinction. Each layer of mud and ash was a reminder. Collapse could strike without warning, but people endured. The city's record, pressed into earth and clay, offered a tangible pattern, cycles of destruction and renewal, echoing the silent warning found on the king lists. What disappeared was not the city itself, but the memory of what came before each rebuilding. Warnings pressed into clay thousands of years ago feel distant, until the pattern they describe starts to echo in the present. Joseph Tainter, in his 1990 study of collapse, found that ancient societies rarely fell to a single blow. Instead, they unraveled under the weight of complexity, systems built to solve yesterday's problems becoming too costly to maintain when new threats arrived. In Mesopotamia, the cycle of building, flooding, and rebuilding played out over centuries, but the tempo of collapse can accelerate. Archaeological records show that, on average, major polities in the region lasted about 300 years before splintering or vanishing. Today, the same forces that haunted the scribes, drought, famine, war, and the limits of what a society can manage, are back in sharper focus. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports a 30% rise in severe drought events across the Middle East since the mid-20th century. Ancient omens warned of rivers drying and fields turning to dust. Now, satellite images track shrinking reservoirs and abandoned farms in real time. Tainter's model describes a tipping point, the moment when complexity, meant to shield a society, becomes its undoing. The king lists, with their abrupt breaks and vanished dynasties, read less like distant myth and more like a cautionary ledger. Each reset, whether triggered by flood or famine, erases what came before, leaving only records, and sometimes not even those. The clay tablets survived by accident. The civilizations did not. If the pattern holds, the present isn't an exception. It's simply the latest entry, waiting for the next line to be drawn. Civilizations are never as permanent as they imagine. Babylonian tablets endure where empires vanish, warning that collapse isn't legend, it's history on repeat. Today, global risks, climate, conflict, resource strain, mirror the old omens. The record doesn't promise mythic resets, but it does prove one thing. Those who ignore fragility become footnotes. How we write our own era depends on what we choose to heed. What would our tablets say?